This is Chang of Fools, and I'm here to talk about the Sony RX1R Mark III, why I pre-ordered it, and my thoughts after owning it for about 5 months since it's come out. Let me just say, I'm not a dentist, I'm not a doctor. Frankly, I've never made 6 figures in my life, and I'm Canadian, so I'm not rolling in cash. On top of that, I'm currently unemployed right now. I'm just a fool who loves his hobbies and makes poor financial decisions, but I've always loved small form factor point and shoot style cameras. Actually, give me 1 second. Probably not a great idea trying to do this all at once. Here's a Yashica T5, a Nikon AF600, a Nikon 28 Ti, a Contax T2, a Contax T3, the Fuji GA645, a medium format point and shoot camera, and my Minolta TC1. Oh, and a Sony RX100 Mark VII. I'm not going to go through my entire camera history, but I did own the original RX1. And if you took a close look at the thumbnail shot when I got the RX1R Mark III, I still had the Leica Q2, the Fuji X100V, and the Ricoh GRIII as well, before I sold those off and decided to only keep the RX1R Mark III. I have tried the Fuji GFX 100 RF, but I'm not actually a huge fan of the GFX or even the Hasselblads. So I'm going to interject a little about the competitors while I talk about the RX1R Mark III. And I think the RX1R Mark III gets a lot of hate because it's not aimed at the general public. It's really aimed more for fools like myself that have more money than sense. With that out of the way, let's get started with the thing that sets the RX1R Mark III apart from its competitors, and that is the autofocus performance. It is by far the best autofocusing system out of the bunch. The Fuji X100 Mark VI comes close, but still pales in comparison compared to the RX1R Mark III, especially when it comes to tracking. The continuous autofocus system in the Sony is still one of the best in the market, and it is much better than the Leica and the Ricoh for that matter. That said, because it's using an older lens design and most importantly the older autofocusing motors, that autofocusing motor can't really keep up with super fast moving subjects like kids or pets, especially when they're up close. At medium to long range, the autofocus motor has no real issues keeping up. Continuous autofocus with the Leica and the Ricoh are pretty much non-existent. Those cameras only really work well in single point autofocus, though I will say because of the older autofocusing motors, it's kind of funny being able to hear and feel the autofocusing motor move back and forth while you're trying to focus, though you can actually still hear and feel that with the Fuji X100s and the Ricoh GR. Though I will say the Leica Q is pretty much near silent while it's focusing. The build quality is pretty good if you've ever held one. It's very similar to most high-end Sony cameras. It's nothing that really stands out, unlike the Leica with its full magnesium build and super solid feel. Now that actually feels quite premium in the hands, though because of that it is quite a bit lighter compared to the Leica, coming in at 498 grams as opposed to 743, which is a pretty noticeable difference. The Fuji X100 is actually a little bit heavier at 521 grams. And frankly, nothing comes close to the Ricoh GR at 262 grams. So I have small hands, and as you notice, I do have a grip attached to this. The camera to me actually feels quite nice even without the grip, but obviously a grip does make it feel quite a bit nicer. I personally actually found the Leica Qs to be very uncomfortable to hold. The smooth finish doesn't allow for much grip, so for the Leicas I found a thumb grip or an actual grip for the camera itself pretty necessary in order to actually hold and use that camera for longer periods. And the Fuji and Ricoh in my hands, no real issues. They both feel great in the hand. It does really suck that this is not weather sealed, especially for the price, but really only the Leica Q2 and up are fully weather sealed. The Fuji isn't fully weather sealed out of the box. Water and dust can still get through the lens. That's why Fuji tells you to buy the filter ring adapter and a filter in order to properly weather seal their cameras. And the Ricoh GR has no weather sealing at all either. Just like any other Sony, the RX100R Mark III is super customizable with 8 custom buttons. So just like a lot of Sonys, you could set it up the way you like. That was something that really actually annoyed me about the Leica Q, because there's barely any custom buttons. The Fuji is actually also quite customizable, and the Ricoh GR actually is even more customizable than the Leica Q in my opinion. So the viewfinder on this has gotten a bit of flack because it is only a 2.36 million dot EVF. Honestly, the resolution on the EVF isn't as important to me as the magnification, and at 0.7 times magnification, this is actually more than enough. Now the Fuji X100 has a 3.69 million dot EVF, though it is a little bit smaller at 0.66 times magnification, and the older Leica Q2 also has a 3.69 million dot EVF, but at a slightly larger 0.76 times magnification, and at least in my opinion, it's pretty hard to tell the difference between. The difference in magnification is actually a little more noticeable in my opinion, but the Leica Q3 has an even higher resolution EVF at 5.76 million dots and 0.79 times magnification. I will say, once you're higher than 5 million dots, it is actually a more noticeable difference. But even then, unless you have the two cameras side by side to compare, it's not the easiest thing to notice. And that's coming from someone that's using an A1 Mark II that's filming me right now that has a 9.44 million dot EVF at a massive 0.9 times magnification. That you could see a noticeable difference. Now, the lack of a tilt screen really does suck, especially when the previous model did have one. It's really hard to go back to a camera that doesn't have one. Though, I mean, Leica only just added one to their Leica Q2, and Fuji only added it with the X100V as well. So frankly, they're still kind of new to smaller point and shoot cameras for some reason, and Ricoh still refuses to add one. But if the next GR5 does get a tilt screen, I'll be pre-ordering that day one. The other big con is the fact that this camera doesn't have any kind of image stabilization, and Fuji only just added that to the X100VI. The Leica Qs have always had image stabilization, and even the tiny Ricoh GR managed to include IBIS ever since the GR3. And the fact that Sony didn't put IBIS in this does really suck. Though to me, it's not that big of a deal because I don't really shoot in super low light environments or really drag my shutter speed. Considering all the film cameras I shoot, I'm pretty used to trying to stay above the 1 over your focal length rule, and I'm perfectly fine cranking up the ISO if I need to. But if you do shoot in low light a lot, or like to drag your shutter below 1/30th of a second, not having IBIS can be a pretty big con depending on what and how you like to shoot. Now, one other limitation that this camera seemed to get a lot more flack about compared to everyone else is the leaf shutter and the max shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second wide open. That's not an issue that only this camera has. Most modern leaf shutters generally max out at 1/2000th of a second. The Leica Qs all max out at 1/2000th, same with the Fuji X100s. The Ricoh GR with its slower f2.8 lens maxes out at 1/2500th of a second. They all have the same limitation unless you actually stop the lens down in order to get 1/4000th of a second. There are a few exceptions to that, like some of the new Hasselblad lenses for the X system, like their 90mm f2.5 that can actually shoot 1/4000th of a second wide open, and the GFX 100 RF can also shoot 1/4000th of a second wide open. Mind you, that lens is an f4 lens, so wide open is f4. I think it's more because the Sony RX1R Mark III does not auto switch from mechanical shutter to electronic shutter the moment you go past 1/2000th of a second, unlike everyone else. Except for Ricoh, that is. Ricoh doesn't have an electronic shutter, it's mechanical only. So very few people probably notice that it switches over to electronic shutter once you go past 1/2000th of a second when you use the Leica Q or the Fuji X100s. Now, for some reason, the Sony RX1R Mark III doesn't have an auto function to automatically switch from mechanical to electronic shutter once you go past 1/2000th of a second. Now, I haven't found that to be an issue because I've just set one of the custom buttons to switch the shutter type manually myself. The main reason why I kind of prefer that is because most of these cameras all suffer from pretty bad rolling shutter. So if you're panning around a lot with any of these cameras, when it's set to electronic shutter, you are going to see rolling shutter. And because the Leica Q3 uses the same 61 megapixel sensor as the RX1R Mark III, they both look pretty bad if you're panning around a lot and you're using the electronic shutter. And if for some reason you're using electronic shutter on the GFX 100 RF, it's even worse. The Fuji X100 handles rolling shutter better than either of these cameras, but it's still not great and it can be pretty noticeable in certain situations. And again, the Ricoh doesn't have an electronic shutter, so rolling shutter is not an issue at all for them. And at least the Fujis and the Ricoh have a built-in ND filter for when it's too bright outside and you don't want to switch over to electronic shutter in the Fuji's case. Honestly, I really wish that Sony would have just put the 50 megapixel sensor that's on the A1 in the RX1R Mark III, because I really think it would have been a better fit for this camera, since that camera has almost no rolling shutter at all in photos. Though while we're on the topic of leaf shutters, there is one really nice advantage you get with them, and that is the fact that if you use flash, you could sync at 1/2000th of a second or faster without having to go into high-speed sync, which is super inefficient and lowers the output of your flash, but that's a topic for another video. But even this tiny little Godox IT30 and the tiny X3 trigger make for a super portable tiny off-camera flash kit that you could just bring around with any of these cameras. This, without any modifiers, is just enough to overpower the sun on a bright sunny day. The only thing better than a leaf shutter would have been if Sony decided to put a global shutter in here like the A9 Mark III, since at that point you could shoot at 1/80,000th of a second. But there's a caveat to that, but again, discussion for another day. Now, the battery life on this is not the greatest. If you've ever used any of the NPF W50 batteries, you know the pain. On the plus side, at least it's nowhere near as bad as the old NPBX1 batteries, but you'll still want to at least bring a spare or two if you're out shooting all day. The Leica Qs and the Fuji X100s have a much better battery life. Hell, even the Ricoh GR's battery life is frankly on par, if not better than this. Now, even with all the flaws, this is still my favorite camera. To me, the autofocus reliability alone is what sets this camera apart from everyone else. The hit rates that I had on the Leica, Ricoh, and Fuji were never never really that great. A lot of times I take snapshots of my wife or my dog and cat, and the autofocus 8 out of 10 times would miss the eye. It'd often get the nose, in the case of my wife, her glasses, or just the side of the head, and would often miss the eye. The RX1R Mark III gives me consistency. Frankly, the only thing that really bothers me is the lack of a tilt screen. But with that said, having a viewfinder to me is much more important than a tilt screen. To me, being able to bring a camera up to my eye is so much more important than a tilt screen. Just the act of bringing a camera up to my eye makes me feel a lot more connected to my camera, and really makes the act of taking a photo feel a lot more deliberate and intentional instead of just shooting with the rear screen. Shooting at arm's length, staring at the rear screen has always felt so much more disconnected to me. To me, whenever I stare at the rear screen, it makes it feel like I'm just taking a photo with my phone. It's a lot more spray and pray to me, as I don't feel like I focus on the frame nearly as much when I'm just staring at a rear screen like this. And I know I always felt this way specifically with the Ricoh GR since it doesn't have a viewfinder. Not to mention the rear screen was really hard to see on super sunny days. It just felt more like I was using a much higher quality smartphone, and that's not a bad thing. I still love the Ricoh GR and would frankly get that over the Fuji X100 or Leica Q. But to me, looking through a viewfinder and being able to concentrate on my framing and my composition makes it feel a lot more intentional whenever I bring the camera up to take a photo. But there are plenty of times where having a tilt screen would be so much nicer, since I don't always want to lie on the ground when I want to get a low angle shot. The other thing specifically about these types of fixed focal length cameras is the fact that it's actually pretty nice being limited to only one camera and one focal length. Whenever I use my other cameras, I always have that nagging thought in the back of my head saying, hey, maybe this shot might look a little bit better with a 50mm, maybe an 85mm, maybe I should have brought the 70-200. With a fixed focal length camera like this, or the Leica, or the Ricoh, or the Fuji, that limitation can actually be really freeing, as I stop worrying about how I could have shot this and just try to make it work with what I have. Now, I know you could self-impose your own limits and only carry one lens with you when you're out shooting, but to me, that nagging voice in the back of my head was always there, even if I only brought one lens with me, because I know I could change lenses if I really wanted to, and I could have brought another lens with me, whereas with one of these, you're stuck with what you got. But to me, having a small, dedicated, fun camera that's just there to take snapshots, capture my daily life, and honestly just to play with, really brings the joy of photography back to me. And the RX1R Mark III to me fits the bill. Are any of the photos I've taken with this thing actually any good? No, not really. Could I have gotten the exact same shot with an A7C and a 35mm 1.8 for a fraction of the cost? Absolutely. Could I have even just pulled my phone out and got a very similar shot? Yeah, probably. But to me, there's something really special about having an actual dedicated camera to bring around and just have fun with. And I know I'm speaking from a place of privilege when I say this, but I frankly don't know the last time I've taken that A1 Mark II outside to just shoot for fun. To me, that's become a dedicated work camera. It's not the thing I take out when I go out with my wife, hang out with friends, but having a small, fun little camera that I could just bring around with me to capture my daily life, whether it's the Sony, the Leica, the Ricoh, the Fuji, or any of the film cameras that I own, makes me shoot with a little more intention as opposed to just pulling out my phone and taking a snapshot. Plus, that I'm not glued to my phone screen the whole time. So is the RX1R Mark III worth it? Absolutely not. But then again, is the Leica Q3 worth it? No. But then again, same thing with a Ferrari F40, a Ducati Panigale V4, a Pinarello Dogma F. But none of these things are really made for the masses. And frankly, that's okay. You don't need to spend $6,000 on a brand new camera for that matter. Just like how a new oven isn't going to make you a world-class chef. All of these things are foolish purchases for 99.9% of people out there. And you know what? I bet no one even noticed that there were shots from the Leica Q2 and Fuji X100V that were snuck in with some of the example photos throughout this video. There's almost always a cheaper option out there that can do the same thing for less. Whether Sony or any other company wants to get into the luxury market, let them. Not everything is made for you, and whether the camera does well or not doesn't affect you. So stop caring about what other people are going to spend their money on, and understand sometimes you're not the target audience for a product. Leave it to people like me that have more money than sense to buy these overpriced items, because again, you need to understand this probably was not made for you. And with that said, it's slowly getting darker outside, as you could probably see. So I'm gonna go take my dog out for a walk. It's time for you to stop watching YouTube videos and get outside already. I'm just a fool who loves his hobbies and makes poor financial decisions. Right, Mocha? This is Mocha, and she loves butt smacks. All right, get off. Cat and dog. Why? This is Pico, and she keeps wanting attention. Just like Mocha over there. Oi! Oh my god. Oh, jeez. Gonna be killing the audio with my lav mic here, girl.